If you collected comics back in the 80s, you might remember that shipping schedules were a little bit different. You had monthly comics, and certainly plenty of them. You also had bi monthly comics that would come out, and people just kind of accepted this. But kind of two things happened. Comics were not late. And now, as soon as I said that, by the way, some people are going to come in and say, well, wait a minute, there have been late comics. Yes, absolutely, there have been late comics, but nowhere close to what we have today. But the fact that we had bi-monthly, the fact that we had even quarterly issues, anthologies, there was a much more variety to shipping schedule, planned variety, than there is today. Why is that? Hey everybody, this is Perch. If you collected comics in the 80s, in particular the 80s, that's a good decade to look at. It There were a lot of different shipping schedules that would be used for the market. There were, certainly annuals. We know those, and those come out once a year. Thus annuals, and they would come out fairly like clockwork. For a long period of time, the comics coming out were extremely reliable. You had monthly comics, you had bi-monthly comics, you had quarterly, you had annuals, and it was very predictable when these things were going to come. And the monthly comics didn't really move around too much. You could pretty much set your watch on a third week of the year. Here's the book that's going to come out, and the cadence of the books was very reliable, and it led to a lot of. And frankly, there weren't many of them, but when there were crossovers or events like that where things hopped different titles, it was pretty reliable that you wouldn't get things out of sequence, or you wouldn't have kind of month come out and then nothing for 2 months and then suddenly three comics all at once. It was much more of a machine. Now, some people have credited Jim Shooter with this, but that's and I have no doubt he helped push things along in terms of the schedule. But DC was fairly reliable too. It wasn't like it was only Marvel or only Jim Shooter that did this. It was a lot more common in the industry for there to be more expectations up front in terms of what you were going to get. The strange part, if you compare it to today, there's certainly a lot more comics going out the door, but in theory, there should be a lot more predictability. We've got digital tools to help communicate with retailers and customers. We have different printing options that make the whole process a little bit more reliable. A disaster at the printing line back 30, 40 years ago was much tougher to deal with than one today. You have multiple sources for printing, and you just have more options in your hands today. Yet the schedules and the overall shipment of comics seems a lot more random. And I'll say it. I put it out this way: if I look at Secret Empire, for example, or some of the recent Marvel events, Marvel slipped into this approach where they would double ship the first couple issues, and then they would kind of settle back to a monthly or even later kind of cadence, and then in some cases maybe hurry up the ending. It's not reliable, and seemingly every event there are logistical problems with crossovers or tie-in issues that don't ship on time, or just they're too early, and they have to say make sure you read this comic before this comic. There's just a lot of maneuvering going on today that didn't exist back 35 years ago, which is peculiar because, again, we have all the tools and communication. It should be a lot easier. I mean, the sheer amount of scheduling products and things like Zoom or Skype or Slack, or there's a lot of business tools to help you coordinate. A lot of comic creators use Google Docs to help them coordinate. Despite all these things at their fingertips, it's still very, very random. And so at times you look at it and you say to yourself, is this intentional random? Or why is this? We've heard people like Tom Brevoort state that no, the shipping schedules were planned this way. It's hard to believe that because it makes no sense to the people selling the comics or even the people reading them. And even though you say it was planned this way, it doesn't hold up when nothing really connects. I think that's one of the problems with comics right now is you want things to be reliable. You want there to be just a very steady process of how comics work. And instead, you see it's just a guess, and it shouldn't be. Um, the other problem, I mean, the other part I wanted to get into here is, could these systems even work? Now, this is an interesting. This has nothing to do with kind of the way comic industry works today, which seems broken and odd in some places. But if you were a comic company and you said, "Hey, we're going to put out this comic bi-monthly," would that even work in today's kind of modern world? I think there's increasing evidence that suggests that even monthly shipping doesn't necessarily work. The world's quickly moving over to streaming services where they just dump all the episodes at once, or you see Disney doing things like letting The Mandalorian go out once a week, in an old traditional format to kind of break that, binge method. It's too early to say whether binge or, timed releases are going to be, which one's going to work. But what I think is clear at this point is the idea of 8, 10, 12, or even 20 episode seasons go all at once without breaks, and then take long hiatuses, like what you see with shows on HBO like Westworld and Game of Thrones before that. That's how the system now works. So if you look at comics, you have this monthly forever kind of mode where once a month a comic's going to drop, and there is no seasonality, there is no break unless they decide to quit the comic and reboot it a couple months later. Does that work anymore? Is a month too long between issues? A number of different companies, TKO being one of them, there's a few, have started to experiment with this idea of just release the comics all at once or release it in a quicker fashion and then take a break. And I think that model is probably what the comic industry needs. It's just going to take a lot more kind of effort and logistics to get there. Because the problem is the scheduling that I mentioned earlier that seems so haphazard and random. If you're going to suddenly move to a world where you're going to release comics like seasons, where maybe you release a comic a week for 3 months and then nothing for the rest of the year, that's going to take a lot of foresight and planning, or it's going to be a disaster. Right now, I think if comics move to that, it would be an absolute train wreck for retailers, for customers, and for the publishers themselves, because they just do not have enough kind of understanding of the industry that they're in to properly pace out these comics. HBO lives and dies in many cases by kind of their movies and their ongoing series. Yes, they get a lot of attention with things like Westworld or Game of Thrones or Sopranos. They're bigger name shows, but people don't cancel HBO the second Game of Thrones ends. They keep it, and they keep it because there's just enough value with the other shows, with the other programs, with the movies and other things that they have, that it's worth waiting for your favorite season to start back up again. With comics, there's just not enough going on with the industry to trust that same model will continue. Now, I think this will work great for the indies. I think if you are, certainly TKO, but if you're, everybody under Image, you ought to be thinking about this approach. A streamlined, maybe every 2 weeks, or if you have the content and you have a lot of interest, every week, shipment of the title until it's done. I think that's not a bad approach as as an indie company, as a portfolio company. Trying to compete with the big guys, or the big publishers on a month-to-month basis is probably a losing proposition for you. But overall, it speaks to the whole idea of publishing schedules and everything else is probably due for a fairly significant change at this point. Or maybe it's overdue is a better word. The rest of the entertainment industry has moved to different models. Comics has maintained its same structure, except at the same time they're not even doing their same structure very well. They claim to be monthly, but it's still anyone's guess what's actually going to happen. The pandemic certainly threw a bunch of things for a loop, but if you just look at 2019, there were comics that were double shipping, there were comics that would take longer breaks. I mean, look at the Dawn of X line as an example. You had a lot of momentum going in with House of X Powers of 10, and then there was a massive amount of double shipping that created collisions with the storylines, and just it almost burned through a lot of the stories, a lot of the goodwill very, very quickly. Anyway, what do you think? What kind of model would you like for publishing? Would you like as a traditional monthly and you would just like them to do it more reliably? Do you miss the days of bi-monthly and quarterly and annuals and think that that still has a place for the industry? Or do you think that comics really needs to wrap their head around streaming type services where they dump all the comics in a series at once, or do it in terms of a much more quicker schedule and then a long break? What do you think works? Leave me a comment below. Let me know your thoughts. Otherwise, like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter and Facebook at Comic Perch. But most importantly, thanks for listening.